Welcome to Fireside, where we sit down with successful founders every month in order to capture their stories, insights, and lessons learned along the way. Hit the follow button and subscribe to our newsletter for more, link in the description. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So when I look for speakers for Fireside, I always look for a great story. What happened with you is that not only you have a great story, but you also have an intriguing side to your story. So we're going to try to uncover here a little bit. Because not only you completely aced the corporate world as a senior executive, but you also succeeded as a founder. And the two don't always connect.
No, not always.
So we're going to try to understand the why behind all of that as well. So you're a senior executive, or you've worked at BBC, Intel, Google, YouTube, Meta. Then you quit, and now you're a founder in the tech and wellness spaces.
That's right. Yeah.
Two-time founder.
Yeah. Two-time founder.
But you started as a journalist.
Yes.
So with the BBC, or maybe not. But
Yeah.
What got you into journalism in the beginning?
I've always been interested in sort of the idea of uncovering different perspectives. We're raised in a certain way in different countries with a certain narrative. And very young, I realized that the narrative that I was given growing up in the United States was not necessarily one that was particularly inclusive. It was telling a particular story. Every country has their story, and every victor writes the history books. I'm the son of a 6'3" Kansas farm boy. His mother's from Oklahoma. She's part Native American. My mother is a 5'1" Palestinian refugee who was forced from her home in 1948. The time of the Nakba, 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their home in 1948. So I was raised as Patrick Walker, as my wife likes to call me, a passes white Arab, in a place that was a fascinating place, and I was very fortunate to grow up in Seattle, Washington. But I noticed that there were a lot of stories, a lot of things that were, I think, lacking different perspectives, particularly growing up in the US, in the West Coast. My only interaction with Native American culture was when we'd go buy illegal fireworks at the Snoqualmie reservation, where they were allowed to sell almost dynamite-sized fireworks, or homeless people on the streets of Seattle. But I started to inquire and learn a lot about that culture, and I always felt this sort of strange sense of guilt and both pride in my country at the same time, which is quite unique for somebody my age. And same thing as a Palestinian child. You know, my teacher told me when I was 8 to never say I'm Palestinian. People tell you you're a terrorist, to hide that part of my being. My mother was concerned about me being discriminated against, and she never taught me Arabic. And that was disconcerting, but I was at the same time, even when I would talk about being Arab, I would almost have to qualify that by saying, but I'm Christian Arab. So my mother's a Christian Palestinian, grew up in Bethlehem. And so it was weird that I had to sort of suppress that part of myself, but at the same time, I was very curious. At the same time, my grandfather fought in World War II. He fought against the Japanese. And I became very curious about these people he would tell me these horrible stories about. But I was also interested in martial arts, and I was interested in Japanese culture and manga and all these things. So I started this journey very young of exploring different points of view, and journalism as a field. Actually, storytelling, filmmaking was my initial passion. Was something I became very passionate about. That through storytelling, through great stories, through great works of art, and I was inspired by a lot of film directors like Roland Jaffe and his film The Killing Fields, which told the story of America's big mistakes they made during the Vietnam War that led to the rise of Pol Pot and deaths of millions of innocent Cambodians. And so, whilst I wanted to become a filmmaker, my mother, being a refugee, is like, why would you want to work in creative industries? You need to be a lawyer or a doctor, as a lot of immigrant parents tell you. But I found my way still to USC, where I ended up studying journalism, and at night I took film classes. But it was really out of a desire to find creative ways, and particularly because I have a short attention span, to do it quite effectively and efficiently, to tell stories that help, I think, broaden people's points of view.
Kind of like get the second side of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we hear this a lot, both sides, but I think there is an approach one can take in this world where you can go a little deeper. And I love this quote by Bob Woodward, who wrote the story of Watergate, who wrote the story All the President's Men. He said, there is the nearest obtainable version of the truth. And that's not always a convenient path. It's a hard path. And oftentimes it goes against the grain of everything that you've been told. And it could put you in some trouble if you really go down that path. But there are certain narratives that we're told. Noam Chomsky talks about this sort of occupation of the mind, of the manufactured consent, and it's very real, and it's getting worse in many ways. But there is an obtainable version of the truth. And whilst there are always more than two, there's many perspectives on the story, you have to look at your values and what you value. Let's talk about the Native American experience. Sure, two perspectives. People were coming, they needed a place to live, they were well-intentioned homesteaders or settlers, but ultimately, this well-intentioned settler movement led to the death of 50 million Native Americans who don't even appear hardly in American textbooks anymore. So whilst there are different perspectives, you can pick a side, which perspective aligns with your values and which one you think we should be sharing so that we actually improve as a species, as opposed to whitewash horrors from our past in the name of two sides, when in fact we should be trying to, I think, aim for a greater, higher purpose through learning from our mistakes. And I think we have a long way to go as a species to do that.
There is a noble pursuit in the idea of listening to all sides of the story.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's probably one version at a given time that is closer to the absolute truth, right?
Yeah.
And not by a little bit, by like an 80 or 90%.
Correct.
So, but you, especially you as a journalist, how do you distinguish between your perception and your subjectivity versus which story was actually closer to the truth? And how are you able to reconcile that kind of tension?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, you have to recognize that the more you know, the less you actually know. This is like a Socrates quote. And so you have to be very humble in the face of knowledge. There's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger curve. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I love this. It basically shows, on this side of the axis, you've got confidence. On this side of the axis, you've got actual wisdom. And people that have very little knowledge or wisdom are often the most confident. And then you reach what they call the peak of Mount Stupid. Then there's like slow decline of despair when you learn more. And then you get towards the pit of despair, which is basically, I don't know shit. I'm so confused. And then there's a slow growth over time when you match knowledge with experience that equals wisdom, where you slowly grow in your true understanding. But that's also with an understanding that what you don't know will always be greater than what you know. And so for me, first of all, go to source knowledge, go to source information. There are a lot of people that have opinions, which is totally fine. You can pull your opinion based on what you've heard, but be ready to challenge yourself with those opinions. But there is source information out there, and there are very well written, extremely good books on almost any topic. And you can also determine by doing a little bit of research who are the most reliable academics or the most reliable authors. And you also should read the people who are telling a particular propaganda story, because that's part of the picture. If you're going to be effective in a discussion, you need to understand the perspective people have been taught, so you can actually have a way to challenge that effectively. So I think there is an obtainable version of the truth that does take a lot of work, and you also have to be ready to let go of everything you knew to be true. And that's actually really hard. It's really uncomfortable. Your whole perspective, it doesn't mean you need to throw away everything you loved about where you're from or the culture that you're backing, but you have to recognize that part of your responsibility as a citizen of that place or as a part of this world is to challenge these narratives so that we can improve them. Again, we don't perpetuate the sort of mistakes that we have lived. And I think we are still living in a very, I think, in a culture that is still, I think, excusing a lot of misbehavior in the name of progress at the expense of a lot of people who are fighting for recognition and fighting for rights. And we have to keep fighting.
Very interesting. From what I'm sensing is the issues of your teacher telling you when you were 8 years old that you should hide your true identity.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like it gave you a drive to go out there and show another version of that story to the world.
Yeah.
And it kind of corroborates with a lot of successful people who had a challenge in their childhood who ended up going after it and taking on the world just to show that they can do something big.
Yeah.
Have you ever reflected on your success, generally speaking, from the childhood perspective?
Yeah, I've reflected on it, but it's quite interesting. It's so much easier to understand looking back how it sort of made sense. So my career is actually, I couldn't have predicted what I was going to do because a lot of the stuff I did didn't exist. I mean, YouTube didn't exist when I was a journalist. And one of the things, when I was in graduate school, I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I was working for the Institute for International Development there. And I realized that a lot of the projects that we were working on that I felt very strongly about, the funding would come and go based on U.S. political situation, right? 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, they'd be interested in improving the relationship with Pakistan. The next year, they'd pull all the funding. And I didn't have much patience for that. And I saw these professors who are amazing, wringing their hands like, everything I did for 8 years is in the toilet. And that's where journalism stood out for me, because you could actually go, you could do hard-hitting stories, you could pursue that. But I actually ended up, strangely enough, despite wanting to go and work in international news, or even international organizations like the UN, by a whim, I ended up getting hired by a Japanese TV network to produce children's television in Japanese for Japanese kids about the world, which was a weird, hard turn. So sometimes you even have the most well laid out plans, and you go and you do all these things. It was literally like a chance meeting with somebody who said, "Oh, NHK is looking for interns that can help them internationalize their programming in Japan." And I'd been there already learning Japanese and martial arts, and I thought, that sounds interesting. Next thing I knew, I'm 6 years in Japan, making children's television about the world for Japanese kids. I ended up making a film during the 50th anniversary of World War II, and this is about the perspectives, which was fascinating. The film was about how 50 years on, America and Japan teach the world the war completely differently. The textbooks, the stories are completely different. And in America, they're also very different. Whether you're in Seattle, you're teaching perspectives on the dropping of the bomb, or if you're in Oklahoma, and it's like, if that bomb saved one American life, then so be it, right? And that's the way it is. And that was also a fascinating way to get deeper into these perspectives. The BBC came knocking after I did that film, and I ended up going into hard news, which was actually my dream. Again, it was on a chance transition window where I just happened to meet somebody from NBC. They wanted to hire me. The BBC sat across the hall. Then they saw me, and we started talking. And that began a whole new part of my career, which was chasing hardcore conflict zone war stories, which I absolutely loved. It was actually like a job designed for me somehow, as much as my now ex-wife hated it.
I don't know if she's watching us then.
No,
So,
my beautiful now wife is here.
New wife hates it too.
The new wife hates it too. She's glad I'm not doing it anymore.
you want to the chat.
Yeah.
So, okay, so at this point in your career, you're pretty much seeing everything through the lens of stories.
Yeah.
And then you somehow entered into the tech world.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between tech and stories for you at that point? What was it? Was there a relationship?
It's a good question. Actually, you know what? Technology is a tool, and it's a very important tool for storytelling. Just like the pen and paper is a tool for writing, the camera and the editing equipment is a tool for visual storytelling. And even when I was in high school, I was like pushing my school to get video equipment, and we pushed and pushed, and they finally, in my senior year, had the very first film, audio visual class. We started doing stop motion animation. We started making running gun documentaries, and so the technology allowed us to express our stories in a way that could be distributed in more broadly than just doing theater and play, which I love to do as well. NHK was fascinating for me in Japan. It's the national broadcaster. It's like the BBC of Japan, because they were the world-leading researcher on high-quality, high-definition television. And even though I was making these children's televisions and documentaries, I kept going and hanging out around the technology lab to the point where they said, "Oh, hey, we're opening a new high-definition TV division. You want to come and be a director here?" I'm like, "Yeah, let's do that," because it's 16:9. It's really good quality. And so I was always drawn to the latest tech as a means of storytelling. So I thought, what if you could tell that story, but it's prettier and it's bigger screen? What I didn't realize was how undeveloped that technology was, and how many years it would take for all the cameras and equipment to shift from this 3x4 tiny screen to a big screen. And it's quite funny to think about it now, but when that was happening, camera crews didn't want to go to work. They were striking because they're like, nobody wants to watch 16:9. And TV presenters were like, I'm not showing up because my makeup's not good enough and the picture's too good. And so it was quite funny to see at every change and transition of technology, there were always the naysayers who were pushing back. And ultimately, over time, it would progress. So storytelling and technology for me were always intertwined. At the BBC, I was the first person in the field to start using some of these things called the Toko, which would allow us to transmit stories digitally from conflict zones without having to go on the roof of a shitty hotel and like put up a massive satellite, which is quite dangerous. So we'd have small ways to sneak in, do our stories, get through town without having to go and pay off the local broadcaster to send a story that the government didn't want you to send. So these technologies allowed us to edit on laptops, reduce our amount of gear. Instead of having a 4-person crew, you'd have a 1-person crew, eventually like a just me crew going to Cambodia for a story. So the technology part was always deeply interwoven. And then somehow, again, I ended up getting involved in the digital piece initially because the BBC wanted me to do a lot of stuff for online, but nobody was online. And I just became fascinated with this idea of short form videos for the internet as an additional distribution mechanism.
We're gonna do a quick technical pause.
Sure.
Because you're not being heard perfectly.
Okay. Is that better? Always hits my scarf. They okay?
Okay, great. So next, what I wanted to know is, you ended up working with Google or YouTube.
Yeah.
And that kind of pushed further the tech aspect, right?
Yeah. So going back to my ex-wife, she hated my job, and this was in 2000. We just finished a huge story. People from Portugal know the story about East Timor, the collapse of that regime, which was looking to dominate East Timorese, and they voted for independence, and Janata Gusmao came back. That was the last big news story I did. It was also very dangerous. A lot of fellow journalists were killed. And I was up for a new gig in Jerusalem, Moscow, Delhi, South Africa. And my ex-wife was like, "You're not doing this work anymore. I've got one baby, one on the way." And I'm like, "But this is what I'm good at." She's like, "Keep your job or keep your wife." So I started looking. She wanted to have the baby back in Europe. So I started looking around. And the one thing I didn't want to do was work in the BBC office in London, calling people like me to say, "Go somewhere cool." That would be soul destroying for me. But again, strange meeting. Some guy used to be an NBC News guy who was creating a new thing called Network of the World, short form video for a new generation. It doesn't have to be 30 minutes. It can be as long as it should be, which was revolutionary at the time. It was a very well-funded project in 2000. It turned out to be a total disaster, but it's what brought me back to London. It's what allowed me to learn the language of short form storytelling, learn the language of digital rights, learn the language of, working in, with music rights and sports leagues, which eventually led me to being hired by Google to develop their international video strategy. So that was another one of these weird sliding doors moments where, had I not been sort of forced to leave this world I loved as a journalist for personal reasons, I wouldn't have found my way really at the dawn of a really burgeoning career in digital media, where I was somehow one of the early people that kind of knew the language, the rights, the deal-making potential for this world. And shortly after Google hired me to do Google Video at the time. YouTube was kicking our ass. This was 2006. I was part of a team that recommended we acquire YouTube. We were successful in that acquisition, and the next thing I know, I was like the first YouTube person outside the US, and I had to now somehow launch it in all these different countries. Now, you see YouTube today, it's old media. YouTube today making billions of dollars a month. YouTube today is the place where everybody goes and spends time. At the time, it was very popular, but it was under attack by advertisers, under attack by rights holders. We had billion-dollar lawsuits from Viacom, from Mediaset, from TF1, from the French Tennis Federation, from the Premier League. And not only was I building this business, I was also defending in court all of the things that they said we were doing with copyright. So it was a really exciting time where we didn't know whether we'd survive from month to month, whether these lawsuits would take us down. But ultimately, we prevailed, and this became, for me, one of the most exciting ways of storytelling, which was not just me making stuff and using tech to send it out, but allowing anyone to be a storyteller from their phone and upload it to the world. That was super exciting.
Anyone is a creator.
Everyone, yeah.
To YouTube and all
Yeah,
that.
and one person's treasure is another person's trash. There were advertisers saying, "We will never advertise on YouTube. Why would we put an ad on somebody, putting Mentos in a Coke bottle and spraying their friends?" A year later, Coca-Cola sponsors Mentos in Coke bottles, like Bellagio Fountain. It was the #1 ad in 2007 for sponsored videos. Eventually, people go where the audience is. But yeah, it was not clear at the time that we would ever make money for partners, where we would not be shut down for lawsuits. But it was super fun.
Wow. So when you were charged by Google to grow YouTube
Yeah.
in EMEA, you had to also build an international team. So
Yeah,
you kind of start from scratch in
It's
Europe.
literally me. And I had to start hiring people that were able to do deals and help us, because we couldn't launch without having local content in France, Germany, Spain, and music rights deals. So I started hiring people that were amazing, trying to find great minds. And thankfully, if you're working for Google/YouTube, you get a lot of amazing CVs. People really want to come work for you. So I had the pick of the litter to hire some amazing folks. Some of them, the woman I hired to run Spain is now global head of VP of Business Development for Netflix, another guy is Chief Content Officer at Pinterest. These are amazing folks who've continued to thrive in this industry. It was not easy, but ultimately we had the tailwind of consumer support. Ultimately, we had a lot of ad dollars coming in, and eventually creators, rights holders could make good money. Germany was slow because they kept suing us for music copyright infringement. But eventually, pretty much every country came online, and that was exciting. 7 years later, I like to build, and I like to do the alchemy of the deal, the first deal in this, the first time that. I love launching new countries. When it got to a place of, okay, we're good, it's now about watch time and conversion rates and drawing more people to the platform, that's when I started losing interest, and I went to more of an entrepreneurial life.
Okay. So you did have a quick stop at Meta before or after?
No, Meta came later. So I took, after 7 years at Google, actually, Mark, one of my colleagues, I was a sort of a founding investor in a company called Base 79, which was it was a company that helped rights holders be successful on YouTube. And we were very good at it. And that was eventually sold to a company called Rightster that was public on the UK AIM market, small market. They acquired us. I became the CEO after we realized that the company that acquired us was basically cooking the books. And it was like being asked to pilot a plane when it's about to crash. And I always wanted to be a CEO, but in that context, it was hard. But if I left, it would crash anyway. If I stayed, maybe there was a chance we could get it going. And thankfully, I had this amazing chief financial officer who was also new. And we managed to raise money again and keep it as a going concern. Once we stabilized it, Facebook came calling, and they wanted to go compete with YouTube on video. So I took that job in 2016.
So then you decide to completely quit and become a founder. You started Uptime.
Yeah.
So two things I'm interested in here. The first one is, why did you decide to become a founder?
Yeah.
And the second one is, what is Uptime?
This is sort of the beginning of the wellness and the health part of my career. So I met my amazing wife, Noemi, who's here. And she's a naturopath and herbalist. We started spending a lot of time out in nature. I started learning more about the health field, started thinking a lot more about it. And I also started thinking a lot more about my own screen time in the window from 2016, where Facebook was loved by everybody. 2016, 17, election meddling, 18, 19, Cambridge Analytica, self-harm young women on Instagram, and all these things were coming thick and fast. And I'm starting to ask myself the question, like, am I doing really good here? Is my time here past? Now, it's super convenient because I got 4 kids in school. I'm making a good wage. I've got all these stock options. If I leave, it's very inconvenient. But something in my heart said it was time to go. I was no longer aligned with Mark's vision. I felt that they were taking too many chances without really understanding the implications. I started studying, learning about the Center for Human Technology. And I had this inspiration to leave and create a learning platform where people could replace their short, mindless scrolling with short, mindful learning. And that was the idea. Now, it was super crazy because I didn't have any funding. One of the big transition points was we decided to take a trip to Sri Lanka as a family and go to this like Panchakarma, spend time in the jungle and just sort of, decompress and think about this transition. And I knew in my heart I needed to do it, but my mind was like, oh, but. And then when we were on this trip, we were at a dinner it was the night before Easter, 2019. And we were sitting across from this family. They were all on their phones. They were arguing with each other. We were like phoneless, total digital detox for 2 weeks. Like, I feel really bad that I'm contributing to this horror show at the table next to me. The girl's screaming at the brother's screaming at the dad's on his phone ignoring the kids. And I felt bad for them. What was worse was the next day, all these bombs went off in Sri Lanka and 350 foreigners were killed in these attacks in all these big hotels. Thankfully, we were staying far, but all these phone calls started coming in saying, I heard these kids from the UK died. Are your kids okay? And it turned out it was that family and their kids. All the kids died except the dad in this bomb. And I couldn't help but think, like, nobody knows when our time comes, but I have this on my head, this concept of being present and being focused is very counter to this idea of addictive tech. And I felt somehow responsible. And on that moment, I decided to leave. And I told my boss I'm leaving. And and we can talk about this idea of sort of aligning with your purpose and taking that leap. But it was a very scary moment. Naomi can tell you, she's like, I've got your back, but I'm scared shitless, right? Because it's a big move. But magically, once I did that, like literally 2 weeks later, I met these two guys that wanted to fund my idea for a learning app. So that was very lucky.
It's kind of interesting because initially you jumped on the digital and the tech bandwagon because it was amplifying stories.
Yes.
Then it's almost like you saw it was going too far.
It's going too far. Yeah, growing up in Seattle, I loved camping. I was a Boy Scout. We loved making fires. We loved storytelling around the campfire. And I always saw YouTube and then Facebook even as another layer of capability of this sort of digital campfire where the world can gather and anyone can tell a story and we're all able to share. And this is amazingly powerful. But I realized that now there were tools that would manipulate that story, that would get this side of the campfire to hate this side of the campfire, that would allow this person to be suppressed and this person's voice to be amplified. And I also learned that these platforms are in no way neutral. And I believed that they were. I would stand on stage in front of thousands of people and say, it's the axe maker's dilemma. Technologies can be used to build or to destroy, and it's up to the individual to make that choice. In fact, all the people that created Instagram, Facebook, they all went to the same business school at Stanford. They all learned from the same guy about, understanding how to drive habitual use, how to create habits in people, how to change the color and the form and the factor so that you can drive more and more and more and more attention of people. And so the deck is stacked against you, actually. I could no longer stand there and honestly say, you're the neutral decider, because you are actually living in a world where unless you step outside a little bit, you don't even know how much you could possibly be influenced. And one of the big kind of awakening points was I interviewed one of the guys from Cambridge Analytica. He wanted his job at Uptime, my learning app startup. And I didn't want to hire him because he was there, but at the same time, I'm like, how did you come about creating this product, which basically was helping to drive people in different, more polarized directions? He said, well, we had this idea that we could provide micro-stimuli to a species and get them to do stuff they didn't want to do, or they wouldn't normally do. So we did it with worms because mice were too expensive, and we do micro-stimulation to a worm who was just observing his behavior, and then we get him to move a little bit every time we do the stimulation, and eventually he would slither his way into acid and kill himself. I'm like, well, this is the underlining technology for Cambridge Analytica. I said, yeah. I said, well, how do you fight against that? And this goes back to your most available version of the truth. It's like, he said, well, you're kind of fucked if you're constantly absorbed in using these things, but you can defend yourself by spending more time and consuming more types of content that you disagree with. And I thought that was really astute. I thought that was super important. That if you just stay in your comfort zone, in your bubble, and you allow yourself to be slowly given that micro stimuli, whatever direction they want you to go for whatever convenience they have to buy something, to think something. If you spend time in oftentimes uncomfortable situations with people you disagree with, and you challenge yourself and you read different perspectives, you can perhaps fight that. And that was actually part of the impetus behind Uptime, because we would make these collections of short form, tappable stories that were synthesizing books, courses, documentaries into 5 minutes with like a visual multimodal way of learning for easy retention. But we would make collections of videos that would provide 8 different perspectives on a topic, so people could actually browse and consume. Whether they went all around, I don't know, but at least I was providing a platform where people could browse and graze on knowledge and challenge themselves. That was part of the thinking, really.
Mm-hmm. So you've raised 20 million for Uptime?
Yeah, 20 million.
Okay, and it's still up and running now?
Yeah,
Did you sell it?
ready.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone
We
can
started
sign
in
up?
2019, and then in 2020, during COVID, we had to go completely remote, which is when also we decided to move to Portugal, and which was awesome, so I could be living here and commute back and forth when necessary. And we quite quickly gained a lot of, I would say, critical support from the platforms. We were Google App of the Year in personal growth. We were only just App of the Day in 14 countries 2 days ago. So we're getting a lot of support from that. But the consumer side of the business is really hard. There's only a certain number of things they can subscribe to and pay for. And there are a lot of apps that it's a great app, but it's not necessarily something you're going to keep forever, like Netflix or Spotify. And so apps like ours or Blinkist or Headway, they're similar. The dropout rates are pretty high. Now you can keep growing the business, but the more dropout rates you go, at a certain point, you need to put more and more and more marketing dollars in, which can be challenging. Now, my co-founders, thankfully, are really, really, really astute business-to-business people. Their last business, they had a huge exit as a B2B corporate wellness app. And so we started transitioning as an add-on, not as a total pivot, towards B2B distribution of Uptime content through corporates. So now we have 11 million users, mostly distributed through businesses. We have our consumer business, but really the growth is on the B2B, which is amazing. And so it's a going concern. I'm on the board, but I no longer am involved in the day-to-day because I made a lifestyle choice to stay in Portugal, which was not easy because that was sort of the comfort of what I knew, sort of that similar decision of leave or stay with Facebook. There was that point of, they're like, are you coming back? I'm like, I don't think so. Then you say, you know what that means, because we're all going back to the office. That's do what you got to do. So it was an important transition. But that was also the time when Noemi and I spoke about, well, one of the reasons we moved to Portugal was because she had this vision of creating this sort of social wellness club, a movement around healthy longevity and healthy living. And I really wanted to be part of it. And so that was also an important period of time where I had to make a hard call. Do I go back to what I know? Or do I make a leap, stay where we want to live for the very first time, live somewhere I want to live as opposed to where work dictates, and then throw myself forward into a project that is more, I would say, heart aligned and also allows us to stay here.
So that brings us to Longevity House.
Longevity House.
Before we get to Longevity House per se, I'm interested in knowing about longevity.
Yes.
So what do we know in 2024 about longevity that we did not know 15 years ago?
She should probably come on stage. She's the practitioner. She's the expert. I've learned tons though. I mean, I've become a student. I'm a bit of a geek. If I get into meditation, I want to learn how to teach meditation. If I get into breath work and cold plunge, and I need to do the training, and I'm learning. But really, her whole premise is, we are, as a species, we are capable by our physiology of living to be about 100 years. Our lifespan has increased over time, not because our capacity to live longer has increased. It's just because our environment has become healthier, child mortality rates are down, and so we've gone up and gone up and gone up since, from average age of 60, 20, 30 years ago to now 80 something. But in America, it's going down. In developing countries, it's starting to peak. Why? Because we are filling our bodies with crap and toxins, and we are filling our children with sugary, crappy foods, and we are pushing things on the market that are very unhealthy for you. And so what we know is, I think it's on you to be aware now of what is harmful to you. Now, just like social media, the deck is stacked against you. They designed this food to be addictive. All the advertising is super compelling. It's on every street corner. So you have to sort of work against your sort of inner desire to consume things that are super yummy and attractive for a more healthy existence. But we know that in our Longevity House business, there are like 8 pillars that we really care about. And these are not based on kind of bro science or biohackers or Brian Johnson. It's based on just, in many ways, common sense and what people have learned and what's behind these sort of blue zones in longevity where people are living on average to 100 years old and they don't have any of this stuff where they live. What do they have? They live on hills where the movement is part of your daily life. So they're constantly moving. They're constantly moving their bodies. They eat healthy food, mostly plants, very robust plants that are often grown in pretty robust and rugged environments. So this very healthy food. They get good rest. Stress management is a very important part of what we talk about. Naturally, they're living in environments that are much more conducive to healthy and enjoyable living, beautiful nature, etc. Sounds like Portugal, right? So far. They also live in communities, and one of our key pillars is social connection. We know that social connection is good for longevity. We know that social connection is good for your heart, it's good for your mind, it's good for your soul. And we know also, the flip side of that is that loneliness can be as bad for you as smoking. All the science points to loneliness being a real killer. So, and if you smoke and you're lonely, it's even worse, obviously. So, social connection is huge. Having a sense of purpose, right? Aligning with something that is purposeful doesn't mean, you're going and ending world hunger, but what is your purpose? I am the grandma that looks after the neighborhood kids so that other people can do, having a meaning every day. They call this ikigai in Japanese. Having a purpose of life that is above yourself. That's super important. People live way longer when there's a purpose in life above themselves. Grandparents who have access to the grandkids live longer than grandparents that don't. These are all really clear. And we also have tools now to monitor our health. We spend more time monitoring the lights and the buttons on the health of our vehicle than we do our own body sometimes. But we now have access inexpensively, mostly, to check in and see how we're doing and make adjustments to that. But ultimately, what my wife told me was that most of the healing that we can do is actually found within and within nature. And if you can sort of align more closely with these more natural approaches to health and longevity, you can live longer and happier. So our motto isn't live longer or don't die. It's a life well lived. Because like that Sri Lanka story, you don't know when and where your time is going to come, but one thing I do know is that when it comes, you want to not have any regrets from the days you've had. And that doesn't have to start at any particular time when you've made enough money or you've got that promotion or you've made, a certain amount of comfort so that you can finally start doing the things you love. It's trying to find that balance between creating that life you love or where you feel valued and you can give value, but also enough to support your, healthy lifestyle.
So I'm interested in knowing. I've read in a million places that our generation might live till the age of 100.
Yeah.
So how true is that? And
I mean, you can live to 100 now. Our generation, if they follow these principles. Now you have the meteors that come out of the sky. That's the cancers. That's these things. Now, lifestyle can affect that, accidents, but there are things you can do to reduce accidents, like don't use your phone when you drive, or certain foods and things are cancerous, but some things you just can't predict. And so again, that's life well lived all the time you're here. Now, there are people who are proposing. It's people becoming very famous and writing big books and selling lots of supplements that are talking about this point at which we can escape age velocity. They call it the EAV. And there's some very smart people behind this. And what they're proposing is that, and this may be the case, right? But I wouldn't put all my chips on it. If you can live for another 20 years from today, you will live long enough for the technology to have allowed to be, we will be capable of extending our life indefinitely. And without even living a healthy life, because there'll be pills and molecules or treatments or taking somebody else's placenta, whatever. There's lots of different ways that you can find ways to cheat death. I have a bit of a challenge with some of their thinking, because I went to see one of their talks they did here, and they were saying that the human body is flawed. It is designed at the outset to die, so we're flawed creatures. And I'm like, is a tree flawed because it dies? They couldn't really answer the question. So why are we different than anything else in nature? Now, it's an interesting question. To prolong life is not a bad thing, but if you're prolonging life without these things I talked about, with great social connection and a sense of purpose, that can be hell, right? That can be very difficult. So now I think our generation could possibly live longer than any other generation. I think part of them will die younger because of these toxins and things that are polluting our bodies. So I think we're gonna have this bifurcation of people who are living longer and people, as we've seen in the US, who are living shorter and shorter lives, mostly people in lower economic status and categories, because they can't even afford the healthy food anymore.
So you said that it's really good to live longer. I just want to say,
I didn't say that necessarily.
You said something along those lines.
I said it's not necessarily bad to live longer.
Okay.
But I think to live longer as an objective, I think is for what? I mean, I want to live longer so that I can dance with my daughter at her wedding and I can hopefully play with her kids. That would be amazing. But if I'm living at the point where I've become so frail and I've become a burden on other people and I'm just ready to go, and it also depends on your philosophy or spirituality, but I don't believe everything happens in this particular moment in this particular plane or this particular life. So I think the idea of healthy longevity can actually be something that you can optimize while you're here, but to just live longer for the sake of living longer, I think that's a very ego-driven mindset.
Yeah, and also like a lot of things we invent or we improve, then we have new problems that show up.
Right.
So like the one thing I thought of when you said about living longer, I was like, do we want a dictator or tyrant to live longer?
Not necessarily.
Exactly. So I'm pretty sure that when we start living longer, we'll start seeing all these new problems show up. Then we're gonna try to create
Trump could
solutions
live
for
another
those.
50 years and stay in power this whole time. Probably. I don't know. I don't know. There are a lot of stories about seeking the fountain of youth or everlasting life in mythology. I think, and we talked in our previous chat about Joseph Campbell, who I love. He's a great comparative mythologist who wrote all these amazing books. He was the mentor for George Lucas when he wrote Star Wars. He talks about the hero's journey. He talks about following your bliss and, surrendering towards the thing that is truly you. And when you do that, doors open where there are only walls. But these stories that he's collected and we can learn about pursuing everlasting life always end badly. Almost always end badly. There's the story of a man who fell in love with this magical princess, and she had immortality. He wanted to also have immortality, so he wished for immortality. She gave him immortality, but he didn't specify that he didn't want to get any older from where he was at that point. So he lived forever, getting older and older and weaker and weaker and weaker until he was a little shriveled pile of aliveness on the ground. Right? There's so many stories like this where people are seeking this everlasting life. So I think we have to be thoughtful. Again, a life well lived, I would say, is a more lofty or a more honorable objective, because it's not putting a particular length of time on it. It's about optimizing the time you have while you're here. And it also means shifting your measure of success. What is your measure of success, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, which is perfect, because I wanted to know, is there a difference between how you saw success early in your career versus now?
Yeah, I've never been somebody I've always pursued stuff I love, and I've always been very fortunate. And I was sort of told, like, if you do what you're really passionate about, opportunity will come. And if it doesn't, you're still doing what you're passionate about. So that's cool. And I had transition periods where I pursued what I love so much, it didn't work anymore. And then I had these windows of doubt, and I was in the middle, and maybe I should just go something for the money. And I did have a couple episodes like that, but I never felt very satisfied. So I was always pursuing stuff that I loved. But doing stuff you love means you're passionate. You get paid for learning. It means you're more likely to be successful because you become good at it. People recognize your passion, and you're more likely to get promoted. And you're doing it genuinely because you love it. And if you manage people, you know the difference between people who are just out for the promotion and people who truly love what they do. People always come to me, and I've hired hundreds and hundreds of people at these different companies, and they're always like, "What can I do to be successful?" Do what you're doing now to the best of your ability. But I want to be this in 2 years. I'm like, then do what you're doing now to the best of your ability. I talked about martial arts. There's this great quote from Bruce Lee. He says, "Be water, my friend." So be water. Flow to the places where things need to. The idea of just flowing into the shape of the space that exists around you. And when you come up to some resistance, gently yield. If you get no resistance, keep going and see where your influence can expand to. I think it's a really important thing about success. I think success, in my world anyway. Now, there are people who are very successful who just focus on the money. Don't get me wrong, right? And that's a different mindset than mine. It's not better or it's not worse. I think later in life, there's maybe a reckoning about what you sacrificed on the way. But for me, it was always about doing something I was passionate about. And early in my career, I always had like a 3-year window. It was a bit annoying. So 3 years into a job, I'd be like, am I still enjoying myself here? Am I making an impact? And am I being paid to learn? And if the answer was no, I was looking at the exit. And fortunately, that exit oftentimes was not always obvious, but there was something that came along when I made that leap that elevated my pursuits. Later in life, there's a choice that has to be made about staying on that treadmill and building up your bank account, these other things, or maybe stepping out a little bit and aligning more closely with your values or your goals, and being in Portugal was a part of that. It would have been easy to stay in one of these big companies, keep earning, keep doing, but I wouldn't have access to the life I have, the more access to nature, being able to walk my dog twice a day, spend time with my family, pick my daughter up and my son up from school, spend more time with my wife. It's like finding that right balance is not easy, but it means you change your definition of success. So if your definition of success is, do my kids want to hang out with me? Do I have healthy relationships around me? Am I able to do the things that I love within reason? And I'm able to make a good enough living to put good food on the table? Then, that's a completely different success objective than I want to be VP and I want to get 5 million, I want to get 10 million, I want to do this. Because I know people who are in 200, 300, 1 billion, 2 billion, and they're still trying to figure out, because they're insecure about what's next? I don't know. I don't understand it, but it's very real. It's very, very real. You know, the more you accumulate, what you have becomes less exciting over time. You're constantly looking to find that new thing that will thrill you. So it's a big lesson, I think.
I've always found that if you focus on one of those objectives only,
Yeah.
you're gonna miss out on a lot
Yeah.
of balance in your life.
Yes.
I've had friends who work in the oil industry in Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia
Yeah.
through their 20s,
Yeah.
basically in the desert, just on oil rigs or
Yeah.
on platforms. And by the time they were 30, they were very rich,
Yeah.
but they wasted their 20s in the desert.
Yeah.
And then you're like, what else could I have learned in my 20s? What other path could I have done where I would have earned a little less money, still comfortable, but probably learned so much more in my 20s, or met more people, or
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think anyone should look back with any regret on anything they've done. I don't think they necessarily wasted their time in the desert, because who knows what they could have been, maybe, I don't know what they would have been doing otherwise. But it's really about, there's this great Chinese saying, there are 2 times to plant a tree, like 200 years ago and now. And so if you didn't do it 20 years ago, then don't worry about it. The only time you have to do that is now. It's the same thing with things you want to accomplish or achieve in your life. I know people, like we have a very good friend who's, he's in a cycle now where he's created so much wealth, but he's also created lots of different businesses. He's sort of over leveraged. He can't stop working because he has to keep feeding this enormous like octopus of opportunity. The solution is actually relatively easy, which is basically give up half of his business. From my perspective, like, well, just stop doing this. Like, I couldn't possibly. There's this drive for success that creates its own flywheel. But I think that at whatever point where you have this realization that you're not living your truth, that's the time to make the choice. And that sometimes you need to do your 20 years in the desert to be able to get to that place of understanding what that is.
Yep.
Right? And that's a hard choice sometimes, right? And sometimes it happens through an illness. Oftentimes it happens through the breakup of a relationship where people have to take stock and think carefully about what they're doing. But there's an inner voice that everybody has, and if you can find ways to tap into it, then it's pretty clear what that should be. And it's generally not saying, go make more money. It's generally not saying, be an asshole, spend less time with your kids, don't be available for your mom. It's not telling you that. It's a very pure voice that's all about, being true to your nature and being part of this community, and also just working on yourself.
The markers of happiness have been studied, like that. There's that 40-year-long
Like
Harvard
7 year Harvard study. Yeah.
exactly, where it's we have the answers now. It's usually community, family, enough money to keep the bills away.
Yeah.
But it's not $1 billion.
No.
The answer is not $1 billion.
No, for sure. I mean, this Harvard study there's a great video on YouTube. I think it's the Harvard study of happiness. Veritasium, this YouTube channel, one of the ones that I'm advising actually, they have a great video like summary of this study, and there are 3 words it sums up as: relationships, relationships, relationships. And this study follows men of all different economic backgrounds. It initially started just Harvard men, and then after 10 years, they started adding people from the greater Boston area to have more diversity of race and income bracket. And then they followed all of them for decades. And they found that irregardless of income, those people that have healthy relationships, not only did they live longer, they were way happier. And that is so important. There's also lots of studies of what people say when they're on their deathbed. What do they wish for? And I don't think anyone could argue that the number one wish is they had more stuff, right? It's just worked more, or spent more time in the office. It's just, so we all know these things. I mean, it's not like what I'm telling you is new, but to actually live it is hard because you have to sacrifice stuff that somehow we've told ourselves is more important sometimes than the other stuff.
Last question before the
Yeah.
audience joins us. What's next for Patrick?
Oh my God. Well, my weeks are really weird now. They're really funny. It's the first time I've lived what I call like a hyphenated life, where I was always doing one thing and I was doing it really intensely, and I was doing things more with family and friends outside. But now because I decided to stay in Portugal, I'm still on the board of Uptime. I'm working, supporting where I can, but it's not so frequent. I'm like 2 days a week as a strategic advisor for a company called Electrified that invests in YouTube and other creators that are mostly in what we call the category of inform and inspire. So the kind of content that I really love, that I think we should see more of, content like Veritasium or Astrium, like big science, learning, astronomy, coding, all these channels that we are providing funding and helping them grow. So I do that like 2 days a week. 2 days a week or so, I'm working with my wife on Longevity House with events and activities. And we do big weekend events, we do education. And then I have one day, and by the way, for me, I could probably get 7 days of work in 5 because I'm weird that way. I like to work late at night sometimes. I'm doing also now stuff that is just more heart aligned. I'm doing some work in human rights. I'm doing some work in social justice, and this is done on a like pro bono basis in support of different organizations I really care about. Some in relation to Palestine, and other topics I think that are needing more storytelling and narrative change and understanding. So it's a blend. So I'm actually really satisfied with this diversity of experience. Some things I get paid for, some things I'm investing in to build something new, some things I do for free, and I've reduced my living here as opposed to London. You can dramatically shift your sort of cost of living and these different things. You can organize yourself in a way where it's, at least for me, it's become possible. Also, granted, I worked hard and had some savings that we could invest in this new business, but it's a constant process of reevaluating quite on a regular basis whether, and I think this is that 2019 moment. Now I'm like, if my heart and if my soul is telling me something is no longer serving me, I'm not going to hesitate to move off it. And so that's oftentimes inconvenient because some of the most lucrative things are those things. But when I do that, also new magic happens and new things emerge that I wouldn't have had the time for these things if I just committed to one particular aspect. So I love mentoring founders. I love supporting different projects. I love also being genuinely, we talked about big tech. My values are no longer aligned with these big tech companies. Not that they're bad. I have a lot of people I love still working with them, but I do know that I don't think that they are necessarily neutral in this world. I don't necessarily think their values are totally aligned with my values in all aspects. I wish them well, but I also think we need to create a protective layer to defend ourselves from this sort of onslaught of technology that is pulling us away from each other. And so I like the idea that for me, working in health, the future of online is sort of offline now. My campfire is now a real campfire. Or a sauna, where you can actually sit in communion with real people and have real conversations and build real relationships, and these can endure. I think this is beautiful. But I'm very fortunate I can tap into my old world and do these advisory jobs, which I really enjoy. So, but watch this space. It's a journey. I'm still working really, really hard.
It's always a journey.
Yeah.
Patrick, thank you very much.
Yeah, that is.
Now it's your turn.
I have a question. Thank you, Patrick, for the great talk. So you work in two of the most dominant, in terms of technology and influence companies worldwide, YouTube, Google, and Facebook, Meta now. What do you think are, from an internal culture perspective and from an execution perspective, and you also you joined them at different times. YouTube was in growth phase. Obviously, Meta, when you joined, was much bigger beast.
Yeah.
But from a culture and execution of the strategy, what are the differences? Who is doing or was doing better or worse at these two things?
It's a good question. So I joined Google. It was. I mean, relatively speaking, it was quite early, but it felt like it was a more mature company. The culture was amazing. I mean, having worked only for public service broadcasting up until that point with NHK and the BBC, and I always felt like a public service kind of person, where I was more sort of values aligned. I was doing things that were designed to inform and inspire people, not for profit motive. But Google felt very much like a not-for-profit that was out to inform people, make information accessible to everyone. And YouTube was this revolutionary force. Google was very good way early on in empowering people, I think internationally in particular, and well, also domestically, but it was very good at allowing smart people to come in and do good work and kind of get out of their way and allow them to really push forward. So it was very entrepreneurial as an entrepreneur, if you like, within a company. I think the culture was genuine. The people were amazing. And I really drank the Kool-Aid and I became a great fan of it. As it matured naturally, as it becomes now about when YouTube starts making money and start growing, and all of a sudden you're getting these bigger and bigger deals, and then it's now about watch time, and then you're protecting the revenue. That it starts to shift, and that's normal. But I love being in that sort of growth, exciting, creation phase where you're building a vision, and then once it gets to that point, I think that was wonderful. Now, Meta, when I went there, it was all about the good vibes. Early 2016, it could do no wrong. The share price was through the roof. Everybody loved it. Everybody was on it. It wasn't just people's moms and old school friends. It was like the place. Instagram too, just been acquired. WhatsApp just been acquired. Like, ooh, changing the world. But I found that it was much more Mark-led. And everything sort of stemmed from Mark Zuckerberg's mind. It was very product focused, which isn't bad, but they hired me in part to change the paradigm with partnerships, where Google was very good at real partnerships that are mutually beneficial. We invested a lot in these partnerships, and we would thrive in these relationships. Facebook wanted some of that partnerships magic, but every time we would go and structure partnerships around the media side of things, they were always optimizing for feed ads, and so it wasn't as genuine. The empowering of people in different offices in different markets was feeble. So no matter how big a team you'd build or how much influence you'd have in these different markets, you were always at the whim of some product decision back at Menlo Park. Whereas at Google, if I had a different direction we want to take YouTube internationally, I was able to close a deal with the Olympics or something, and they couldn't even get a deal with the local, sports league in America because they were much more amenable internationally, and our team was really good. We would change the product to support the deals we would do. We would change the product because we had to do a different thing in Turkey. We would change the product because we had to really win Germany, and we had no music rights deal. So and Eric Schmidt, I still believe, is one of the greatest leaders, and I was very fortunate to work close to him a lot of times. And he was just like, "How much do you need for this?" I would say this much. He goes, "I'll give you double," because I trust that you guys are going to do the right thing. Whereas it was a very different culture. Even though Meta was more evolved, it was an older company when I started, it still today, isn't one where I think they were able to really reward the great workers internationally with a lot of freedom. Now, I would say that's also now shifted at Google. A lot of my old team that are still there, they're kind of cogs in the wheel, and that's just normal. It's just how things go when they get big. So they hire great VPs to run this or that in different markets, but they're the job's pretty predictable. What they can do is relatively limited. And that's just the nature of growth businesses. And that's also why I love working in startups now, because the sky's the limit. It's all very unstructured. The good thing about working with Google at the time particularly was it was like a startup shop, but you had great funding all the time. So that was very special. But I love both. I met great people at both, but Google still has a very strong place in my heart. And that experience was unique. No offense, Mark.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I really appreciated and actually found quite an unexpected story from you, so thank you very much for it. I wanted to actually ask about what you said about your childhood, where it was this sense of, because of the circumstances of your birth, you, as opposed to maybe the kids next to you, you had more of a sense of the story that you were being told about the world might not have necessarily been quite just exactly as you were being told in school and other places, and you had a great exploration of how you went about and discovered that. My question was how that being of that kind of ilk served you or not through your school journey, but more particularly through corporate America, which I feel can often be a place that very much decides that things should be like that. And then a small corollary to your Bruce Lee quote, that one should be like water. I feel water is often found in ponds and streams, but it's also found in waterfalls. So I also, if you had any comment about that, that might be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, my experience as Patrick Walker is very different than my cousin, whose both parents were Palestinian, growing up in Atlanta was, growing up in America. So I could turn on or turn off my Arabness. Mostly it was off my whole life. But at my mother, I was raised by a single mom. My culture was very Arab. My food, my family, the language in the house, everything was, my wife says, a passageway Arab. So I grew up in this world where I also felt not part of that white culture. And I would say it wasn't like an intentional thing to benefit from it. I was just myself, and I went different places. But I also found that as I would go up the chain, particularly in some of these big tech and media companies, and I would never use identity to make a point on something, but I started to find that there were policies that were discriminatory, particularly toward Arab world, particularly towards things that were challenging the dominant narrative. And these were working their way into our company policies well beyond laws that would be required for us to do so based on certain Washington, D.C. based policy people's points of view. So as an example, we at YouTube were tasked with allowing major and smaller media companies to go live worldwide on YouTube. It was revolutionary at the time. Al Jazeera had just started. A lot of my former BBC colleagues were going to Al Jazeera, great journalists. They couldn't get any broadcast deals in North America because nobody wanted to work with this Arab broadcaster. And I managed to strike a deal with Al Jazeera to, for the first time ever, make them globally available worldwide through streaming on YouTube. Now, people in Washington started saying, no, we can't do that. It's a terrorist organization. I'm like, where does it say that on the terrorist list? And they couldn't find it on the list because it's not there. But like, we know. And I'm like, well, and I didn't say anything about my background because it was irrelevant. I was just saying, I'm responsible for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. One of the biggest broadcasters in the Middle East is Al Jazeera. We are making available this tool to all these broadcasters, and there's no reason really why they shouldn't be involved. Eventually, I had to go to Eric Schmidt. He overruled them. Al Jazeera went live worldwide on YouTube, and it was like a great story in the New York Times. YouTube is revolutionizing media, and whether you agree with it or disagree with it, you should be the one to make the choice, not let CNN or somebody else sort of filter that knowledge from overseas. It allows you, in this world of closest available version of the truth or best obtainable version, let's get all the stories out there for people to make a choice. So I constantly found myself, as I was going up the chain, encountering things, and even sitting in all white boardrooms or in different places where people were saying stuff in front of me that I was just quite shocked about. And I kind of felt like I was behind enemy lines in many ways about really trying to represent diverse voices. And even when I was at graduate school, I would sort of speak on this topic and people would ask me, why do you care? You're white. I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of white. But so, but even when I would tell them I was Arab or Palestinian, they wouldn't believe me because I was there in the room with them, and B, I didn't really look like it. I didn't match their perspective of what that meant. Their view of a Palestinian was not me, therefore I couldn't possibly be Palestinian. And so they're like, yeah, but you're kind of one of us, right? I'm like, nah. I mean, what is it? I don't know what that means, but I don't know if I fully answered your question, but it's like trying to stay true to myself, but also recognizing that in many ways, the higher I went, I'm not sure I would have been there if, and it felt more and more uncomfortable as I was rising up the ranks in many ways. Because still today, there's a very dominant voice, and it's not necessarily a white voice, but I think it's definitely a Western voice that is pursuing a particular point of view and pursuing a particular agenda that is not necessarily, pushing for equality. Does that make sense? And the second part of your question about be water, yeah, I mean, look, that's a really good point about be like water, because water, when it's stagnant, becomes putrid, and that's also a place of decay. So be like water, always find ways to flow, all right, and find ways to move forward. It's like the Rolling Stone that, doesn't gather, you don't gather moss if you're moving. And I think that's true in careers. I think that's true in life, is that if you're settling, then you start to become less dynamic, and things also can start to become, you start to get a little bit of entropy for your career or maybe for your relationships a bit.
Yes, you did answer my question very well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Another?
Thank you so much for everything that you shared.
One of my biggest takeaway from you is to be in alignment, and I just admire your courage in doing that. My question is it possible to have it all? Because you have been in environments where you've been with a lot of powerful people, you yourself a very credible person. So is it possible to be in alignment with your values as well as be wealthy, follow your purpose, follow your passion, and have it all?
That's a good question. I feel, by speaking openly about how I feel on some of the injustices in the world right now and historically, that I could lose it all tomorrow. Genuinely. There are people out to control a narrative that doesn't make room for these points of view. And they're even changing the law to that effect. I would rather be aligned with my values and lose aspects of my, I would say, commercial capacity than be silent or adapt to something I don't believe in for profit. So have it all, again, it's like, how do you define have it all? I think, to be comfortable enough that you can put good food on the table, your kids can be well educated, you're able to support a relatively comfortable well-being, but also be aligned with your values is not always obvious, and it's not always easy, but I think it is. I think it is possible, but you may have to shift your definition of all, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people maybe say, yeah, but when it comes down to it, really, it's hard. And there's a great poem by Rudyard Kipling called "If." Anybody familiar with this poem? I recommend you read it. It's one of these things where I used to read it to my kids all the time, but the reality of this is very difficult. So it talks about, and I'll paraphrase very quickly, if you can, have it all and then lose it all the next day and not mention a word to anyone. If you can basically be in the lowest of lows in the gutter and not feel self-pity. If you can dine with kings and also go and spend time with paupers, but be yourself all the same, then you will be a man, my son. That's kind of a summary. And so trying to walk that path, consistency on your values, irregardless of your circumstances, is easier said than done. And I've been fortunate to be challenged in that many times in my life where I had to make hard choices. But I always knew that even if my comfort would increase as a result of that non-aligned choice, I would feel worse than if I stayed true to my values and I had to readjust my life as a result. Does that make sense? So now there are sometimes limits to that. There are certain times you need to sort of put the placards down and just kind of get on with your business because political circumstances change. And sometimes the risks may be too high. And that's a choice people have to make. Or maybe they move country to a place like Portugal where you feel more free. But it's a worthy journey, I think. It's a worthy journey. Yeah.
Do we have a last question? 2 last questions.
Yeah, I can give shorter answers.
All right, let's see.
Patrick, Tarek, thank you so much for this discussion. I'm glad I showed up. Patrick, I have a question regarding how did your connections play a role in your career path? And did you push, were you lucky to make these connections, or did you show up at the right place at the right time? And would you be able to achieve alone without having these connections?
So connections that aided my career growth? Yeah, that's a really good question. I talked about doing your best at whatever you're doing at any given time. That pays off your whole career. And also, you never know when the person who is your, quote, adversary in a certain period of time might actually be a potential partner. Good case in point, we were being sued by the Premier League at YouTube, and I was literally in court, like $1 billion lawsuit defending YouTube against the guy who was from the Premier League. And afterward, we'd go have a beer. We'd have a chat. Whereas other people, they would be genuinely upset and genuinely adversarial. I'm like, we're actually sort of playing a role here. We have a position to keep, but we can actually be human. 3 years later, he was representing another sports league, and he wanted to do a deal with me because we had built a relationship through the toughest of times. I have to say, my opportunity at Google came because I had a boss who'd just been hired at Google, and when I worked for her, for another company, it was called Real Networks, which invented streaming video. That was between the startup that failed when I came to London and Google. When I worked there with her, I worked really hard, and we had built a relationship. And when she said she could hire somebody to run her partnerships and media side, she thought of me because she knew I was good at my job. So it wasn't out of like a special connection because we went to school together or something. It was really more that genuinely, if you love what you do and you put your all into it, that's get recognized. You build genuine relationships, and those genuine relationships can last over time. So in the time I spent also at Google, at Facebook, hiring people, being part of different sort of industries, now as a strategic advisor to this company I advise and other people I advise, I can genuinely like call up, the YouTube headquarters and say, I'm bringing the CEO for a visit. Do you mind having a meeting? And they're like, yeah, sure. I'd love to see you. Let's have lunch afterwards. Now I have to be careful how I use those. They have to be genuine, requests. You can't abuse relations. We all know people that are on LinkedIn trying to get something from you. You're not quite sure exactly what they want. But I think if you create meaningful relationships in the time you have with people, those relationships will deliver over time. But it's not like you can be, I would say, scheming about it and having relationships to have these, or you can just be genuinely open to nice relationships and do good at your job, and those things will just take care of themselves. What was the second part of your question? Is that it?
Yeah, that was-
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that was it. And the second part, it's also connected. Would you be able to achieve what you achieved without these connections?
These are like, I talk about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. You have to look out for those sort of helping hands from time to time. And I think the more you align with your purpose, the more you sort of surrender to this great mystery, these helping hands sometimes magically appear. And so, no, I couldn't do it without these connections that were fostered. Sometimes it's just a magical, weird, out of the blue connection. Like I have lunch with somebody. She thinks, oh, I don't know why you should meet this guy. That guy ends up funding my startup. So sometimes you don't even know. In the weirdest of places, these things can emerge. But because I had a meaningful lunch with this girl and we had a heart connection, she felt compelled to introduce me to this guy. Right? You know what I mean? So I think it always links back to being present, taking advantage of an opportunity to get to know somebody, and you never know. I kind of live on the basis that anyone you meet could be your new best friend. And that's for a man at 57 years old, it's not always obvious. You kind of have your old friends and you're kind of shy meeting people to become new friends. But I think, this is part of I've been at Burning Man many times, if you're not surprised. I think it's part of that culture of being open constantly to amazement and curiosity and making new friends. And also passing on those friendships that don't longer serve you as well. Because you can't be open to friendships all the time, they'll drown you. Yeah.
Last question.
I'll stand because otherwise I can't see you. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible career with so many different experiences. And I love how you brought it all back to happiness, and how happiness relies on purpose, redefining success, and relationships. So my question is, how can we harness the role of technology to contribute to our happiness rather than take our happiness away?
Good question. Look, technology is constantly changing, and I think it is a very, very important tool. We need to leverage it. It is not the source of happiness, right? I think people can tend to value the relationships with this false fire of the phone more than the people around them, and that can be it can be quite vapid. And I think our culture is leaning towards prioritizing likes over fewer people that really truly like you or that you can spend time with. So I think leveraging it to a certain extent, but not becoming so obsessed with it that it can start to eat away with the most important relationships that should endure a lifetime. But I am so thankful for technology every day. I could stay in touch with call my mom on Facebook Messenger, during the week, and I'm in My sister only uses Facebook. My brother's on WhatsApp. I've got people who only use Instagram. Some people only use Signal because they're crypto people. And so I'm leveraging these platforms. If I was very particular about not using technology or not using this or that platform, or Facebook stealing my data, therefore I won't use Facebook, I would be missing out on a lot of my happiness in my relationships. But my wife is, I'm very fortunate to have somebody who is very focused and supportive of, choices to step away from, the screen and the convenience of using a screen to pacify children. We do sometimes, of course, like most parents, but trying to create meaningful experiences for the family, being aligned with your partner, I think is really important in that regard. But it's not easy because that screen is freaking addictive. The stuff is so good on there. It's hard. I don't got it right, man. It's hard, but I think this recognition of the problem is, I think, the first step, and then doing small steps to focus on being present, being with people, building meaningful relationships is the key to happiness.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your question.
Patrick, thank you very much.